One thing that you mentioned a while back was the role, and I know my audience will be really interested in this, is the role of utilizing some level of data biometrics. So you said you utilize heart rate variability or HRV and heart rate. I believe you said resting heart rate, but you can correct me if I'm
Yep.
wrong there. How do you utilize those metrics? So kind of take me through the detail of how that's implemented, kind of how you just use it in general.
So I look at again from how do I accumulate as much of what I want in a training period, right? So we have a training session, which is your individual workout in a given day, a microcycle, which is a block of training sessions in a given period. It could be most times 7 days, and then a mesocycle, which is a block of those microcycles, and most times it's four microcycles. So how do I accrue as much of what I need to make gross changes in those output measures? That's where I start. Is if I can get more of those big impactful days towards a greater goal, the better it is. So it kind of falls into this concept of high low or vertical integration, where we look at vertical integration as feeding into the supply chain, feeding into how do I get more of whatever my big revenue stream is, which is going to be anaerobic output. So that increase in the deficit or decrease in the deficit. And I'm really influenced by how well I can recover from that, and that's based off of how much fatigue I produce from those workouts. So if I'm quote
Mhm.
unquote unfit, then that fatigue will really, really be high, and my recovery rate will be a lot longer, which is going to limit how much density of these high intensity training sessions I get in a week, a month, a year. So that would be how I look at first and foremost. When do I need to introduce certain testing metrics? So the easiest one, the the balling on a budget one would be resting heart rate. If we have someone who's training 3-4 days a week and their resting heart rate's above 60, probably means they're very aerobically unfit or they're overly sympathetic. And what we can go from that is look at it. Okay, if they're above 60 and they're training 3-4 days a week and they're under 25 with our elite level athletes, that's a problem. That I can't get as much into that vertical integration as I want from an anaerobic perspective because I'm so limited from a recovery perspective. That when I do a high intensity
Mhm.
sprint, that I produce so much fatigue that it takes me 3, 4, 5 minutes to recover and have to limit the volume I do on that given day. And that limits the amount of volume I can do in a given week, which obviously fractals out into the month, the year, and their whole entire experience. So if I find that their resting heart rate's really high, I got to start there. I got to improve their general fitness. Now, the other one from a really big
Mhm.
point interest session during the actual training session would be heart rate recovery. And if they don't
Mhm.
recover in between these bouts of anaerobic exercise, then I'm going to limit how much I can do. Or if I decide to, I don't really care about that, I'm going to tell them to do it anyway without full recovery. There might be at higher risk for getting hurt, or they could be doing something that's completely counterproductive. They're learning to run slow or jump lower. Like that's what they're doing when they're not completely recovered. And again, that comes down to what is
Right.
their central nervous system readiness. So if they're high CNS fatigue, then they're going to have a longer heart rate recovery. So that's 60 in resting heart rate. And we tell them if we can't improve, we can't decrease our heart rate by 30 to 50 beats per minute in between these anaerobic outputs, that they're probably CNS overworked, especially if they're training consistently and they're young and they're resilient, right? They're just
Mhm. Yeah.
overly
Yeah.
stressed. They're overly sympathetic. We've done a poor job of prioritizing effort and hard work over really good workout economy and getting good results. And we utilize other metrics like gym aware or velocity based training. So if we're not hitting the speed that we want at a certain intensity, again, we're not recovered. Or if we see a massive drop off from rep one to rep two, rep two to rep three, rep four, again, we're not fully recovered. Or even looking at it from a speed perspective during certain running drills. Like if I can run a 4.5 40 and I come back and 2 minutes later try to ask a run again, it's a 5. That's a huge drop off. Performance is no longer there. And go back to resting heart rate and go back to heart rate recovery. Now, where it really
Mhm.
gets interesting, and this is where I think HRV really has a big place, and we talked about this offline, was when we look at HRV, which is like that system readiness, so to speak. I can go into the other level of looking at resting heart rate or heart rate recovery. I can look at it from the perspective of my moving them up and to the right over time from improving that HRV. That tells me I'm doing the right prescription or not. So as I'm making my way through a training cycle, I'm giving them adequate rest in between. I'm getting them another high intensity CNS and focus day. And then I'm working my way back to it. And I'm not making that progression from improving HRV, decreasing resting heart rate, shortening up that heart rate recovery. then I have to start to evaluate I'm probably doing too much frequency of too high intensity stuff, or I'm not
Mhm.
allocating enough rest in between some of these high bouts of CNS work. So all it is just calling me on my natural instinct to do more, right? So my job is to improve those biomotor abilities of jumping higher, running faster, and then throwing something further. I'm inclined or biased to go, I got to double down. I got to push. I don't care if Jay's tired. I'm going to tell him to go again. But I see the next day
Right.
my heart HRVs tanked and my resting heart rate spiked. Even looking at something as simple as blood pressure, like what is your diastolic blood pressure? That's
Mhm.
your vascular elasticity. And if you're inelastic, that probably means that you're pumping a lot of blood out to the peripheral. You can't get as much blood saturated into that cellular level. Oxygen is not getting delivered. And then you become overly pressurized, inelastic from a cardiovascular perspective, and then I have to work that much harder. So you see resting heart rate go up, and then we look at that variability go down. Even looking at it from the level of like, what is VO2 max? It's looking at it from a cardiac output perspective, and that really comes down to stroke volume. How much oxygen-rich blood can I deliver to the peripheral? Really allows me to get more volume anaerobically. So the idea
Mhm.
is, all right, I look at someone that's quote unquote young, healthy, and they're really anaerobically trained, and they're very aerobically detrained or unfit, and that manifests into seeing low HRV, high resting heart rate, high diastolic or overall blood pressure, and then poor heart rate recovery. Where I really need to do
Mhm.
from there, and this is a really interesting part when I look at why I try to tell strength and conditioning coaches it's okay to do oxidative work, is that most changes from a VO2 max, which is going to improve all of those metrics, are coming from a cardiac output. And most of that comes from improving stroke volume. Can I get more oxygen rich blood per beat as opposed to being limited by something like left ventricular wall hypertrophy or just overall cardiac hypertrophy and restricted cardiovascular tissues like arteries and veins, and then having poor capillary density and poor mitochondrial function or amount. And then I'm going to be limited by how much I'm going to get from those high intensity inputs. So what it does, it tells
Mhm.
me, all right, I'm probably going to be better served working more oxidative stuff early. And that could come from longer interval stuff. It could come from just long, slow distance or hitting zone 2 for extended periods of time. And where I work a
Mhm.
lot with strength and conditioning coaches and tactical athletes for that matter is giving them permission to do stuff that they feel like they're not going to do, stuff that's not going to, that doesn't feel like they're going to throw up from. Like this idea that if it's not all gas, no brakes, that it's ineffective or not good use of the time. Like that's silly. And we have
Right.
now research to say that that's actually a bad idea. And yeah, it's great to
Yeah.
want to get stronger and more powerful. And I think it's in human nature to be inclined just to do more of that. I keep thinking about it. You ever see the movie Kingpin back in the
Yep.
day with
Yep.
Woody Harrelson? And then it finds out
Oh
that he was
yeah.
playing 10 and a half frames, or he's playing 15 frames as opposed to 10. And they asked him why. He's like,
Right.
well, the Amish do 1.5 more than everyone else. I feel like that's what we do in strength and conditioning a lot, is like we double down and we do 1.5 more than we should of everything else and not enough of the other stuff that
Yeah.
balances out. And
Yeah.
this simple concept that's been around for thousands of years of duality, and whether you look at it from an Eastern philosophy of yin and yang, or, what goes up, what must come down, like eventually we're going to pay for the things that we overdo. And if we're playing 10 and a half frames over and over and over and over, and we're not taking any care of the other side, and we're seeing all these metrics from HRV, resting heart rate, blood pressure, heart rate recovery, looking at something like cardiac output and VO2 max, then we're going to run into this premature stoppage point, whether it's they're physiologically breaking down, they're regressing, or they get hurt. And that is not the goal. So thinking about
Yeah.
that from the perspective of like it's the ultimate litmus of what I can do, and then it's the ultimate indicator if I'm doing the right amount at the right times as I go forward, which I can totally
Yeah.
see someone struggling with like that. But the other side of it is like, if that's good, you're doing a good job. If it's not, you got to go back to the drawing board and look at what you're doing too much of, probably.
Thanks for listening to the Hanu Health Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. This podcast would not happen without listeners and supporters like you. And the best way to support us and the show is to head on over to iTunes and provide us with a 5-star review. This helps us reach others and spread the good word of breathing and stress resiliency. If we read your 5-star review on air, please reach out to podcast@hanuhealth.com with your name and mailing address, and we will send you some sweet Hanu gear. Until next time, breathe better and stress less.